Hello and welcome to the Mindful Men podcast, a show helping men to open up about manhood. My name is Simon Rennie and my aim is to get men talking. From mental health to fatherhood and everything in between, Mindful Men creates a safe space for conversation. Now, before we get into this episode, I want to say a huge thank you for joining me. It means a world for you to join me and talk about men's issues. And if you love what you hear, please subscribe and share the episode with your mates. You can also join the conversation on Instagram and YouTube, and I'd love to connect with you there. But for now, sit back, relax, and let's get mindful. G'day guys, and welcome to episode 4 of the Mindful Men podcast. My name is Simon Rennie, and I'm the man behind Mindful Men. In today's episode, I'll be diving into anxiety. It's not as dark as the episode we did previously on depression, but that's not to say that anxiety is any less damaging to our health and well-being. In fact, there's people out there who suffer a greater deal of pain or distress from anxiety than they do depression. Now, like I did in the last episode, I'll follow a similar format, and I'll start with some stats on anxiety just to set the context. I think this is important to do because knowing the bigger picture of an issue can help us to understand it better. But I also believe it helps us to realize how prevalent an issue is. And in turn, this can help us to feel less alone in our struggles because we know that other people out there suffering the same. I'll talk about a few different types of anxiety that I particularly experience, and including what it looks like and what it feels like to live with it. We'll talk a bit about some causes and diagnosis, and then I'll share my story in a bit more detail and how I've coped throughout the years. Now, like I said in the last episode, and in fact in all my future episodes, this chat might trigger some of you out there. So please don't feel shame to skip this episode if you think it might bring up some rough emotions. But if you do stick around and you do get triggered, please reach out to your support networks or seek professional help. So let's get started with some data. I love going to the Beyond Blue website because it's a great place for stats. And they draw from references like the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and they make it easy for us to digest. Now, on their website, they're saying that about a quarter of Australians will experience anxiety in their lifetime. And this increases to 1 in 6 experiencing anxiety, depression, or both at the same time. Now, for men specifically, anxiety will be experienced by 1 in 5 during their lifetime. But I think that this figure might actually be higher because men really do struggle to open up about mental illness. For example, only 13% of young men with mental health problems have sought professional help. 13% is not a huge number. And given blokes like me took 20 years to seek help, my guess is that 1 in 5 might be a lot higher, maybe 1 in 3. After all, the stats can only tell us about what people open up about, not what's being bottled up. Now, globally, the World Health Organization estimate that around 3.6% of the global population are living with an anxiety disorder. Now, it's important to note in this that the data that the World Health Organization use group several disorders together, and these include generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorders, social anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, and also post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, that's a lot to group together, but they all fall within that anxiety realm. Now, for today's episode, I'm only going to discuss generalized anxiety and social anxiety disorders, whilst in the next episode, I'll also explore my experiencing living with obsessive compulsive disorder because that one's a biggie. So let's take a look at generalized anxiety disorder. What is it? Well, it's more complex than just being stressed or worried. Stress and worry are normal responses to various situations, and they pass after the situation is over. But generalized anxiety continues on for some time and can become so intense that it has negative impact on our lives. This type of anxiety relates to several aspects of, our daily living, like what's going on at home, school, or work. in our relationships, our finances, our health, going out in a community, and everything to do with COVID. So, what does generalized anxiety feel like? Well, like all mental illnesses, it differs for everyone, but it can feel like constant worry and having trouble with stopping that worry. It's fatigue and trouble sleeping despite that fatigue. It's restlessness, including restless sleep. It's lying in bed all night worrying when the rest of the world is fast asleep. It's also feeling on edge constantly. It's muscle tension, like you're clenching your teeth constantly. Or it's mysterious pain that eludes diagnosis by modern medicine. It's irritability and snapping at people around us for no real good reason at all. It's butterflies in your stomach. It's lost appetite, sweaty palms, and a racing heart as the anxiety increases. It can also lead to behaviors like conforming to other people's requests, kind of like being a yes man. It's being a perfectionist to avoid the anxiety that comes from imperfection and redoing tasks to keep anxiety at bay. It's becoming unsure of ourselves and constantly seeking approval or assurance from others. It's catastrophizing situations or events and over risk assessing our plans because of what if situations that might occur. As I said before, it's a little bit more complex than general stress or worry with a particular situation. And it's constant. And you can be bouncing between 1, 2, or 10 of these things all at once. Now, with social anxiety disorder, the anxiety centers around social interaction. And whilst it's normal to get nervous doing things like giving a speech or a presentation at work or school, the intensity of social anxiety is much greater. Additional symptoms that someone with this type of anxiety might experience is stammering when they're trying to speak, like I am now, excessive sweating, and even nausea or diarrhea. It leads to us isolating ourselves from people or events. We can become more of a recluse than the out and about versions of ourselves from earlier days. And even when it comes to being around people that we know or love, we can also get this kind of anxiety. And then you've got the COVID pandemic, which continues on and on. We get fearful of being near people. We worry about where our friends and family have been before they step foot in our doors. We worry that our kids who aren't at the vaccination age yet, whether or not they'll get COVID. And particularly, we worry about our kids who struggle with respiratory illnesses. We worry that they'll get it and become a statistic to this pandemic. Workplaces, childcare, schools, shops, cinemas, playgrounds, cafes, restaurants, bars, public toilets. Wherever we go, we worry about catching an unseen illness that could kill us or someone we know. Then there's the anxiety that we could be a carrier ourselves and unknowingly infect those around us. Or we watch someone else not wearing their masks or not isolating, not checking into venues and pretending like they're above the pandemic and invincible. We get anxiety about these people being super spreaders. But it's also anxiety about others thinking we have COVID because we sneeze or blow our nose or cough in public. Not everything is COVID, yet everything is COVID at the same time. My daughter has a history of respiratory illnesses and is constantly sick. And when we're out and about and she coughs, you feel the eyes on you like, what are you doing infecting us all? And despite knowing it's not COVID because she's been tested and returned a negative result, you still feel that social anxiety. As I said before, it's a little bit more complex than general stress or worry. Now, in terms of diagnosis, like I said last week, Dr. Google isn't going to cut it. Your best bet is to go see a GP, grab a referral to a psychologist who can assess you. From there, you have a few options for treatment. Psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors, social workers, even occupational therapists can help you work through anxiety. So what about the causes for generalized anxiety and social anxiety disorders? Well, like I said with depression, that's a loaded question and it's not the same for everybody. But common causes may include biological factors such as the way your brain functions or family history of mental illness. Stressful life events like childbirth or relationship breakdowns, moving home or changing jobs or schools. It could be from abuse or trauma experienced when you were young, or public humiliation such as bullying or even just shyness. It could also be psychological in that the person may have emotional regulation difficulties. COVID is a big one at the moment because it just keeps morphing into new variations of itself. Then there's the news cycle that just runs 24/7. And the progress we seem to get with things like vaccines and lockdowns, and followed by opening up the borders again and having greater numbers of COVID than we did before. Now, I honestly don't envy the jobs of our leaders trying to work through this thing. And I think they've done a pretty good job to date, although I do have my doubts about opening up, and it's giving me anxiety because we're seeing bigger numbers. Then, as I said before, there's anxiety about being a parent in this pandemic and what it means for our kids, and particularly because they're the last in line for vaccinations. It's anxiety about whether we'll keep our jobs or when we can see our loved ones again, or about having to homeschool your children and work from home at the same time while also trying to do self-care. And whilst the current vibe in Australia is moving away from lockdowns, I wouldn't be surprised to see them again. As I said last week, the cause of mental illness, and particularly anxiety this week, is different from one person to the next. And that's okay, because in the mental health space, it's not about whose anxiety or mental illness is better. It's not about who is more depressed or traumatized or more obsessive compulsive. It's not about who has it worse off or whether the cause of my distress is more profound than yours. The mental health space is all about supporting people to open up about these issues, to open up and get help, then to help people walk on their own recovery journey. And that's providing they have the right supports guiding their way. And this is important because the journey will be different for different people. It's not a one size fit all type of thing. My journey might be windier or straighter. It might loop around more than yours. And I might feel that I'm going backwards when you're going forwards. Mine might end before yours or end decades after, or mine might never end at all. And that's okay. It's not a race, but it's a journey full of growth, insight, hurdles, and triumphs. So, what has anxiety been like for me? Well, my anxiety is closely linked to my depression and my obsessive compulsive disorder, and it's a lot more profound when I'm stressed out. Over the years, I felt most of the symptoms I highlighted earlier. It entered my life in my primary school years. Up until around year 5 or so, I was a pretty resilient kid. Nothing seemed to faze me, and I went through each day making the most of it. I loved to laugh and joke around. I loved to be active, and I felt a sense of invincibility. But then one day, things started to change. I started taking notice of other people, particularly the bigger kids at school. And I got this butterfly feeling in my gut whenever I walked past them. I didn't know what it was though. And then the more I thought about this issue, the more anxious I got. And sport was a good distraction, but that would be short field because as soon as I'd finished, I'd start thinking about these issues again, like the bigger kids from school or even the bigger kids on the sports field. Things like, were they talking about me, or are they going to beat me up? Are they out to get me? My favorite meal of each day turned into a struggle. The butterflies each morning would make it hard for me to eat my breakfast without feeling like I was going to spew everywhere. And then at night, something weird also started happening too. I would suddenly be lying awake and anxious about the next day at school, or even something that's happening a few weeks away. And I would toss and turn all night. Then I'd start to get this overwhelming feeling that someone was in the house that shouldn't be there. My hearing would go into overdrive, and it would sound like someone was walking down the hallway to my room. Now, to hear someone do this is near impossible because we had a carpeted hallway. But on many nights, I got this weird feeling. And then the footsteps would stop and I would feel like they're waiting outside my door and looking down at me, creeping over my bed. Now, on nights that I was brave enough to have a look, there was never anybody there. But on the many nights that I wasn't brave enough, I would fear that they would take a hold of me and take me away. So I'd stay under those blankets and I'd lay as flat and as still as possible, trying to make it seem like there was nobody in the bed so that whoever was there could move on. The anxiety I felt was fear of being kidnapped or murdered or something like that. And the anxiety grew so intense that it would send weird sensations through my body. Like if I was holding my hand in a tight fist, it would feel like my bones were growing bigger and bigger to the point where they might burst out of my skin. And my hearing would get waves of this deep pressure sensation like someone had punched them. But instead of the ringing sound, I'd get this muffled sound that would intensify before dissipating over and over again. And the only relief I'd get on these nights, which were a lot, would be around 4 a.m. when my oldest brother would get up to have a shower for work. As soon as the water went on and the sound of running water went through the pipes, it was like white noise, and I almost instantly helped me relax and drift off to sleep. Or maybe it was because my brother was being up, it meant that this person that was there who made me so anxious had to run away. Well, I don't know. Fast forward to high school and anxiety intensified. And I talked a bit about the reasons in the last episode, so check it out if you haven't. But to recap, during high school, I grew into a shadow of my former self. I was so anxious about the tough guys at school that I developed depression, avoidance strategies, and a fear of people that has stuck around with me ever since. This also moved to the footy field, where I use my blistering speed to avoid the biggest and toughest players from the other team. And even in the car where I am perfectly safe, I started avoiding eye contact with people in the next car over or people walking along the street, just in case they saw me and they wanted to get me for some reason. And as I got older, this is when social anxiety came into play. As a young man, I was always keen to socialize. I love hanging out with my mates and going to parties. But over time, the extrovert that I was turned into a massive introvert. And all of a sudden, the thought of going somewhere where I didn't know people was daunting, if not terrifying. Even at work these days, where I know most of the people in the office, there's days where I feel so anxious, both generally and socially, that I prefer not to even walk through that front door. And I even get this way before the most interesting part of my job, and probably the part of my job where I'm the best, is before meetings with my clients. I get so anxious beforehand that I'll do more than one nervous wee. And once I'm in that meeting room, I'll be shaking in my chair for at least the first 5 or 10 minutes of that meeting. And then there are the social drinks, which I used to love, but they've become a bit of a recipe for disaster for me. It's the whole have a few drinks, dinner, great time. Then the next day, my mind starts playing games and racing on me. Did I say something that might have offended someone? Did I make a fool of myself on the dance floor? Was that group on the other table talking about me? These things would race through my mind and cause me so much anxiety that I got distressed to the point where I'm a nervous wreck. And as a result, I now often opt out of most social outings from work because I just don't want this feeling. And away from work, I'm feeling it as I turn Mindful Men from an Instagram page into a business. I have huge anxiety about how it's going to play out. And I often procrastinate about things and get stuck in one place. And I even contemplate giving up altogether constantly. My anxiety breeds during these racing thoughts like, will I succeed or will I fail? Will anyone pay for my services in their mental health space? Will anyone listen to this podcast? Is this podcast of any value to anyone? Are people laughing at me while I speak? And this is a weird one, but do I have a good enough voice for a podcast or a good enough face for the YouTube channel that I've got? Am I doing the right thing by starting a business, or should I just stay in my box at my safe job and just keep doing what I've been doing? Or even as a dad and a husband, I get anxiety about getting it right. Am I doing enough for my kids, or will they grow up hating my guts? Am I showing my wife enough attention? Are my family happy with me? Or are they going to be happy in the future? Am I punishing my kids the right way? Am I teaching them the right things? Am I giving it my all, or is my mental illness rearing its ugly head yet again? Are my kids going to get depression or anxiety or OCD? And the key thing with all these examples is that they go beyond the normal levels of worry or stress. My mind fixates on them so much that I get physically ill. I become distant, snappy, avoidant, tired. I get nausea and even the runs from time to time. Then these feelings themselves turn into anxiety about having anxiety. I even question whether I am having anxiety or if I've got gastro or some other sort of gut bug. So there's a few examples of how anxiety plays out in my life. And there's a whole bunch more that I'll share in the OCD episode next week. So please make sure you tune into that because, as I said, that one's a biggie. But for now, having shared how anxiety has impacted me, let me shed some light on how I've coped over the years. And I'll be honest, they're not all good coping strategies. My first strategy was to bottle it up for over 20 years. Nobody knew I was going through this, not even my friends, not even my family. Then, as I became an adult, I started self-medicating with things like beer to calm my mind down at the night time and to help me get to sleep. But in 2012, when I finally reached out for help and I got the help I needed, I grabbed a mental health care plan and some sessions with a psychologist. I started to learn that bottling it up and drinking too much was not the best way to cope. Medication became less of a taboo in my mind and more of a necessity. I felt like it leveled me out mentally and gave me a fighting chance. It also took the edge off the anxiousness and made me feel more level in terms of my temperament. At various stages, I've honed into my exercise and I've found great gains when I do exercise in both my mental and my physical fitness. And whilst I'm not doing as much as exercise at the moment, it continues to be useful to help calm my mind when I really do get anxious. It also helps me get to sleep at night because I've done some effort during the day. Now, when I'm in a good space, exercise, less beer, and eating right, it's all in balance. But I have to say that my recovery pathway is like a roller coaster. So there's times where all of this slips away and I find myself in old habits. Like right now, this past Christmas, New Year period, I'm putting my hand up and saying I've been stuck in a rut. I've been struggling mentally and I haven't bothered with exercise and eating right. As I record this podcast, I feel like shit. And towards the end of last year, I felt like I was dragging myself to December 31st. And I was reluctant to do anything other than eat shit, watch TV, and get on the beers. But I know I can turn this around and I have a plan to do so. And this is important to highlight. We all struggle to maintain good habits. It's normal for us. We all slip into bad habits, and that's normal for us too. The key is to recognize when we slip away from what is good for us, to make plans for change and implement those plans. For me, my plan is to cut back on the beer and shit food. This is the hardest on the weekends because this is where I get the greatest urge, but I know that I can do it. I'm also going to head back to the gym and reestablish my daily routines because I know my mind prefers routine and not the randomness that comes with holiday periods. Underpinning this is being mindful of how anxiety plays out in my life. It's being mindful of how I know when I'm struggling with it, or I've dropped the ball with my routines, my exercise, or I'm drinking too much. It's being mindful of how I act around my wife and kids when I'm anxious, and letting my wife know that things aren't right so that she can help me steer me in the right direction. I've even found a few safe people at work to do this with because anxiety is there for me too. This is something I've only been able to do in recent years, and it's driven by my knowledge that I don't have to be anxious all the time and I don't have to deal with it alone. Sure, I've been managing it on my own for a long time, but I don't have to anymore. I can be relaxed and present and happy. I can be thinking clearly and stress-free. People can know what's going on inside my mind, and I can feel safe in sharing this information. By feeling and acting this way, I can start to live more authentically. There's no more bottling things up, no more hiding the truth. Living with mental illness is not something to be ashamed of. Asking for help is not something to be ashamed of. Keeping quiet only makes things worse. So I'm all in on flipping the lid on mental illness box. I'm ready to start facing the world. Because continuing my life in a way that was not reflecting my authentic self is something that I am ashamed of. In 2022, for me, it's all about authenticity and rediscovering pride and confidence in myself. Now, before I go, I wanted to share a great coping strategy that I've learned recently for anxiety. It's a breathing technique, and I picked it up at yoga, and it helps me calm my mind and focus on one thing and becoming present in the moment. And it's simple. When you're feeling anxious, nervous, or stressed, try this. Breathe in for 4 seconds. Hold for 4 seconds. Breathe out for 4 seconds. Repeat this for a few minutes or as long as you can. Simple, isn't it? I find this particularly useful just before my client meetings, or even when I'm driving in the car and feeling anxious about something, or walking around the block and feeling anxious about something. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you got something out of this episode. Don't forget that if you did get triggered in this episode, reach out to your support networks, please. My name is Simon Rennie. Until next time, stay mindful. Well, that's a wrap for today's episode, and I hope you got some value from it. If anything triggered your mental health today, please reach out to your support networks. Also, if you loved what you heard, be sure to subscribe to the show and share it with your mates. For more from Mindful Men, you can check us out on Instagram and YouTube, and I'll throw the links to these pages in the show notes below. But until next time, stay mindful.